A certain portion of our problems today related to the feeling that some people have of living an unfulfilling and miserable life and being unable to become their authentic self, or in the connection, or rather the lack of connection, with other human beings, have their origin in what I will term the problem of childishness, for lack of a better term. In talking about this problem, I do not intend to say that childishness or childish qualities in and of themselves are a bad thing. And when talking about childishness, I am not referring to the consumerist man-child chungus type of childishness. When I say childishness, I mean to refer to those qualities of innocence and pureness, of creativity, imagination, and wonder towards the world. This problem of childishness stems from the fact that people are unable to either integrate their childlike qualities into their own being, or are unable to reconcile these qualities with the so-called real or exterior world. This problem has two main causes. The first and most self-explanatory one is childhood trauma. This is either an event or a series of events that occur in a person's childhood that disrupts the child's mental development process. Very often this sort of trauma goes unanswered for, so to speak, and that trauma will remain like a permanent stain on the person's psyche. This person will then likely end up living a life marked by the constant attempts to subconsciously take out their unresolved trauma out on themselves or other people. For example, child molestation victims are more likely to become child molesters themselves, thus perpetuating a cycle of molestation that will continue until someone further down the line is able to break the cycle and move forward in life in spite of their trauma. However, there is a second cause behind the problem of childishness, which is much more subtle, and is something that has specifically come about due to the state of the world today. Whereas the first cause is marked by one or several identifiable events, this one is rather like a lifelong string of microaggressions committed against childlike nature as a whole. An example of a person who has suffered these microaggressions throughout his childhood is a man who turns to manosphere and alpha male type stuff because he was picked on often as a kid. This development likely arises from a need for a soft self-defense mechanism, which in this case is the belief that if he gives himself into this sort of ideology, then nobody can ever pick on him again, and even if they did, nobody can do anything that can hurt him again. It gets to the point where the ideas presented in these circles begin to distort his entire worldview and conception of life. He may even begin to impose these ideas on the exterior world, even if the exterior world does not agree with it. The reason why this is different from the cases where something happens in a person's childhood that traumatizes them for good is that there does not exist a single event that can have been said to have traumatized this kind of person. The person as a child may have been picked on or bullied, but usually these are minor incidents, certainly to the point where, for example, if the child were to talk about them, there's a high chance that the person they confide in will be dismissive. Then, over time, these little incidents pile up, the child begins to feel resentment, and then he begins to develop coping mechanisms, such as in adopting a pseudo-hypermasculine worldview. Now, one can easily make fun of this person and call him childish for believing such things, but this only perpetuates the divide between people that results from a lack of understanding, which, speaking of phrases and sentences such as, "if we only took the time to understand each other, the world would be a better place," are themselves derided by many as childish. But even if they are, does that make the statement untrue? This then ties into those people who deride those who have lofty goals and ambitions as being too naive or unrealistic. For example, when a kid says that they want to end world hunger or end poverty, it is usually tolerated. The adults around them do not necessarily have a problem with the phrase or the goal, but they all sort of entertain or encourage him half-heartedly, perhaps even mockingly, because of a deep-seated belief that such a thing can never happen. However, when that kid grows up and he or she still says they want to end world hunger or poverty, that is when the so-called adults reveal their true selves and openly mock, deride, and hold that person in contempt for having that as a goal. As we all know, the only goals that people in modern society are allowed to have are things such as graduate from university, become a doctor, buy an expensive car and an expensive house. Any goal that goes beyond these barriers is deserving of scorn and ridicule for being naive, unrealistic, and childish. The reason why this is so is because the will of the adult has been so utterly broken. His so-called realistic attitude is really a way to disguise his thoroughly demoralized spirit. And if they observe anyone displaying the sort of vivacity that says, "My will is still intact," they immediately come out of the woodworks to attack that person, as the mere presence of such a being is perceived as a personal attack on them. Now this all stems from the modern idea of upholding the adult as the superior state of being that everyone should strive to become, and of adulting as the most noble act one can commit. Implicit in this idea is that childhood must be shed immediately after reaching a certain age, and any sort of childish behavior past this stage is to be frowned upon. Of course, like all modern ideas, it is quickly taken to the extreme, as if anyone detects any sort of childish qualities within themselves or other people, they feel the duty and the obligation to actively root out these qualities and destroy them. Not only that, but children are no longer able to enjoy their youth and innocence in the first place, since there is now a great emphasis on the part of society to get the child to grow up as fast as possible, to the point that society is willing to defile a child's innocence without a hint of hesitation. It has gotten to the point that even children themselves want to bypass the childhood and adolescent stages of life, to become a grown-up like everybody else in order to fit in, and they employ various means to do this, including but not limited to actively exposing themselves to violence and sex wherever and whenever they can. Now, some might say that shielding or protecting children from violence and sex and the like is impossible in today's society, because such things are present everywhere in popular media, news, music, etc. However, I believe that these people are implicitly admitting that the proliferation of obscene and vulgar topics in our media is a good thing, and that there never really was any point in shielding children in order to keep their innocence intact until they were old enough to experience the real world. Now, in the first place, I believe they are likely doing this because they themselves have lost the will to fight against these forces of evil, and as such have switched sides in order to be on the winning side, despite the fact that there is no winning on the side of the negative forces, and the only thing they will accomplish is the destruction of themselves. But in any case, both of the claims they make are false, and one only needs to look at the mentality of underage kids that revel in posting porn and gore on the internet to prove these points. Now, why is it the case that people feel the need to destroy all traces of innocence and childish qualities in the first place? Well, first of all, as was already mentioned, there is a grand push made by society, which has employed various means to trick people into making the effort to become 100% an adult. I believe this results from the tendency to see everyone and everything as an economic unit to be used in production. Of course, adults are the units who have the highest productive capabilities, while children are poor economic units because they hardly, if ever, produce anything of monetary value. It should not be a surprise, then, that the people that gloat about being an adult and deride childishness are the same people who take great pride in contributing to and being an essential and active member of society. And with most things modern, there is an extreme side to this, which is the hustle/productivity cult of people who do not see any worth in things and activities that do not produce any sort of economic value. Only those things and activities which produce some sort of economic value are worth any consideration. Of course, this mentality that one must always be producing or creating some sort of economic value, or else they are letting themselves and those around them down, has resulted in a plethora of neuroses and psychological disorders, which there is no need to get into here, as enough has been discussed about them. However, there is a great irony in the fact that the people who uphold the adult as a perfect being and are always striving to be one are oftentimes the most childish people, and this time in a pejorative sense. I believe this is an attempt, however ineffective, on the part of their unconscious psyche to regain a part of them which has been lost. Or perhaps it can be understood as the childlike section of the psyche lashing out from its being actively suppressed. To neglect and repress a part of yourself, whether consciously or unconsciously, only serves to amplify 1,000-fold. Taking this into consideration, is this in itself not proof enough that the struggle undertaken by the modern man to kill any and all traces of childishness in him in order to become completely an adult is not only a pointless struggle, but a deeply unfulfilling one? Well, okay, live and let live, right? It is the individual's decision to try and become adults, and who are we to say anything about them? But of course, that isn't the end of it. As we have said before, these people also feel the need to belittle and then attack others for exhibiting childish and innocent qualities. Why is this? The only conclusion that really makes sense to me is that they unconsciously recognize that those who hold childish and innocent qualities, especially those that do so in spite of the horrors of the modern world, are higher or greater than them. Now, this is representative of one of the symptoms of modern society, this tendency to drag what exists in the higher level to the lower level. The modern man, in his limited and narrow worldview, is incapable of understanding that which is good and noble and innocent. Indeed, he is frightened by it, so much so that he cannot even bear to be in the presence of such a thing or person, and as if by instinct, attempts to strip that thing or person of all of the qualities that make it good and noble and fair. By extinguishing, or rather, defiling those qualities, he is dragging it down to his own level, and only when he achieves this can he finally rest in his illusory satisfaction. Well, okay, why does this all matter in the first place, right? How does this affect you personally? Why should we attempt to protect that which is childlike, innocent, and pure? I am inclined to say that we should engage in this struggle just because there exist those who are against these qualities and want to destroy any and all traces of them, and that we should start doing things that make no economic value for the sake of it. But I know, not many people will be convinced by this argument. Rather, I want to get people to think about whether or not they are being authentic and true to themselves, even if they are seen as childish for doing so. To deny a part of a person's self results in the development of various psychological disorders, as we can see in those people who burn out after working 80-hour weeks for months or years, for example. Now, believe it or not, but apparently there do exist those people who are satisfied and fulfilled by this type of life. But if a person gets burnt out of that kind of life, it means they aren't that kind of person. They neglect themselves for what they are led to believe is the greater good, and they suffer greatly for it, while having absolutely nothing to show for it. I want people to acknowledge that they are more than just cogs in the machine, that they should do things that fulfill them even if people look down on them for being childish or unproductive. I do not mean to say that you should go out and start collecting Chunko Pops. Consumerism never brought anyone any real joy, and there is a point to be made that it is simply a perfection of slavery. Rather, I believe that people should simply start doing things, even if they don't make any money, simply so that person can develop themselves to reach their full mental and spiritual potential. The creation of most art rarely makes people any money, yet people make art anyway. Studying philosophy makes no money, yet people do it anyway. This is as it should be. All noble and spiritual tasks should not make any money, because they are far removed from the modern world's base materialism. Do not let people break you down simply because you do not fit into their view of what an adult or a man should be. Do not accept the falsehood that they proclaim as the reality of life. Strive to become your authentic self. Never compromise on your beliefs. And, most importantly, have fun and enjoy yourself. Bring back that childhood feeling of wonder. Find a way to see color in your life again.